Yes. Yeah, okay.
Right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to today's meeting of the Audit Committee. Just so that we can know who's here, I'm just going to ask people who are not councillors on the committee to introduce themselves. So we'll start with David Walton, is it, on the left?
Thanks, Chair. It's David Walton, Audit Manager. I'm deputising for Andrew Wathen today.
Peter Davis, Chief Officer for Resources and Acting Section 151 Officer.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services.
Just down to the front table. Do you want to start off, Mark?
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Anne-Marie Harkin, Director with Wales Audit Office.
Rodri Davis, Team Leader for the Wales Audit Office.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Should we have apologies for absence, please?
From County Councillor Sheila Woodhouse.
Right, the next item on the agenda is the public open forum. I can see no members of the public present, so I will move on. To note the action list from the last meeting. Okay, well the first one is about performance management. We were to be given a report at this meeting. From the minutes we have a discussion around the completion of staff appraisals took place, and the policy and performance manager stated this is being worked on so they can accurately report on the numbers being completed. They're also looking at possible alternative arrangements using voting buttons. I believe Mr. Davis may have some information on this.
Very much a point of clarification. Thank you, Chair, for just providing that background. And the point of clarification is we will be looking to bring update on this to the next Audit Committee if we are able to get the year-end figures compiled and brought together in time. I think we talked at the pre-meeting. I was provided with the date of the next Audit Committee, and I'm just waiting on an update from the Head of People Services to determine as to whether we can ready that information in time.
Right, thanks very much for that. Unless there's any more query on that, I'll move on to the next action point. Well, it's about the Bribery Act. That's now on the agenda at item 7. There's going to be a presentation for us, so we'll move over that. There's just one more thing I wanted to refer to. It comes from the minutes of the meeting of 31st of January under the item Whole Authority Complaints. It was minuted that noting that the Council is taking on the role of single point of contact for highway issues, it was queried if the authority will take real responsibility for complaints against speeding fines and for parking disputes and complaints. It was also queried there's complaints about Monlife would also be handled centrally. Clarification will be sought on these matters. And I think Mr. Davies has a contribution on this also.
Thank you, Chair. So I've liaised with Roger Hoggins, Head of Operations, and also Michael Collins, who's our Senior Traffic Engineer, and concerning these points raised regarding complaints against speeding fines and parking disputes. Just for clarification, the Council takes responsibility for on-street and off-street parking management. This includes parking disputes for off-street, which the Council actually already does, but now also on-street static parking fines, complaints, inquiries, etc. I emphasise here static because speeding violations and other moving traffic violations remain with the police and go safe. Furthermore, it's probably useful just to highlight to members of the committee that Rhondda Cynn and Taff will be responsible for dealing with the fines and appeals for each PCN issued, and as the authority providing back office support to us and numerous other local authorities. However, and importantly, the Council as lead authority will make the final decision on whether to uphold the decision or not. Gwent Police will continue to consider and enforce issues of obstruction, such as cars parked in front of drop curbs or partially or wholly on the footway or pavement, providing that there are no parking restrictions such as double yellow lines or single yellow lines in situ. I've also been advised that the authority will shortly be issuing a press release and providing targeted marketing to inform local residents of Monmouthshire of the changes involved. Chair, I don't want to draw too much on it, but there was a specific matter that you referred to there with regards to Mon Life, just to simply highlight, and I think I've spoken to you outside of the meeting and other members of the committee will be aware, there is a report due to come back to Council in April around Mon Life and decisions to be taken around that. So I would expect points of clarification previously raised, they will be addressed at that meeting.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. So I'll mark those as that's dealt with. Thank you. The next item on the agenda then is the Joint Progress Report, Statement of Accounts, Refinements. It's a joint MCC-WAO progress document. So can I ask someone from the Welsh Audit Office to present the paper, please?
Yeah, this is, gosh, sorry, first time. Is it further away, is it? Yeah. This joint progress document is quite a unique document that we sort of developed over the years with Monmouthshire County Council. You might be quite familiar with some of the detail because in general it reflects on those misstatements or errors that were identified in the 17-18 financial statements. These are detailed in Exhibit 1. Further detail shows our recommendation and then the progress that the authority has made in meeting or undertaking our recommendation and what they can do to stop it preventing happening again in the 18-19 financial statements. We also report on other issues that weren't conveyed to you in the ISA 260 at the end of the audit. So they're sort of less important issues. Those are exhibited in Table 2. These largely relate to IT issues that have been outstanding, such as the risk register. And then we also have a Table 3, Exhibit 3, and these are issues that were highlighted in the 16-17 audit and have not been progressed or completed by the time of our report. If there's any further questions, happy to take questions on the report.
Well, since this is a joint report, I just wonder whether Mr. Howcroft has got anything to add at this stage?
Not specifically, Chair. I mean, a lot of the parts in the first section, as Roger describes, were reported to you as part of the ISA 260 on the closure of accounts. I'd remind you that those accounts were actually signed off without variation as a true and fair view. There are always aspects that we could do better procedurally. I think one of the challenges we've got is to actually provide a comprehensive set of accounts that is useful to the audience, whilst also looking to actually take effectively a month out of the preparation of it and a month out of the auditing of it. So increasingly you will find that there will be a need to introduce into the accounts a degree of estimation rather than actual figures. And a symptom of some of these suggestions is the netting off of exercises rather than actually necessarily putting things in in its definitive place such that it has no overall effect on the bottom line of the accounts there, simply the presentation of particular lines within the accounts. The ability to show that we've demonstrated progress and actually learning through this only really becomes apparent in the next closure of accounts, and it's useful presenting it to audit committee members and colleagues involved in planning that process, so that it's actually at the forefront of our mind as we're now starting to look at the 18-19 closure of accounts process.
Can I just add a comment? Sorry, I think it is important to state that with regard to the issues that are identified during the audit, the Finance Department in general makes progress against those recommendations and has done so year on year It's more so the only things that remain outstanding are the IT issues that are slightly outside Mark's control.
Right, thank you very much for that. As with most papers originating, at least in part, from the Wales Audit Office, we don't have any specific recommendations for the committee. My judgment is that we note, discuss and comment on the paper as necessary. So do I have any questions or observations from the committee? Yes, Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. One observation, one question. Yeah, I agree with Mark. Most of the errors in inverted commas were posting errors. The net effect didn't matter at all. I note with regards to the IT risk register, that's how the progress is ongoing. How far are we off achieving that? I don't know whether, if you can't answer it, Mark, Peter might be able to, or anyway, whatever.
I don't think either is particularly cited on the detail of that. It's probably something that, as Rodri says, has taken a time to bring about, and there are some IT aspects flowing from the previous audit report. If it's okay with Audit Committee, I'll find out from the officer that coordinates those aspects to get a better understanding for committee than simply ongoing.
Yeah,
if you could, please.
Thanks for that, Mark.
Yep, if you could please, Mr Howcroft. Councillor Smith.
Yeah, very simple one, Chairman. I was intrigued with the Osbaston School that's on Exhibit 3, the transfer of legal title, because I thought we'd owned the school for years, whether we've been developing.
It's a perennial conversation point between me and the auditors. I'm smiling because it's the first time in 35 years I've ever used the accounting convention substance over form sort of thing, which is a bit of a cop-out from an accountant's perspective. But ultimately what should happen to that is that there are schools that where they're voluntary controlled or voluntary aided, the balance sheet entries of those should not be in the council's account. They should effectively be with the diocese. But actually being able to demonstrate why it shouldn't be in the council accounts, one of the prime documents of that should be the conveyance actually to transfer the title. And it would be fair to say that those conversations are quite protracted and long-winded. I may very well revert from my substance over form argument and admit defeat with that until the conveyance is actually done this year, but I'm still considering that at the moment.
One thing, Chairman, I find I read the reports, by the time I got to the end, I've forgotten what was intriguing me at the beginning. I'm learning.
Right, thank you. Any more questions or observations? Councillor Eason.
Thank you, Chair. It appears to me your study of the accounts shows that quite a few presentation errors, really and truly. One presentation error may be okay, but we seem to have 8 or 9. Is there in your mind any reason, maybe Mr. Davis answers, any reason why we're in the position of getting so many presentation errors as opposed to accuracy within the specific accounts? In particular, I was looking at the one to do with plant and equipment. Where's the got to here? Property, plant and equipment were overstated by £1 million or thereabouts. How could we get ourselves in a position where we make presentation errors of that magnitude?
You've actually probably picked one that was quite a unique case, to be honest, if Mark can recall. It was where there was a school that was sort of under construction, I think, and it was valued in both PPE and asset under construction, and therefore we didn't consider the impairment of the actual asset in land and buildings. So it was quite a unique case for that. With regard to probably some of the other errors that we're talking about, maybe in point 12, yeah, I think they could definitely be tidied up a little bit. A lot of them were in relation to the classification of short-term and long-term, and it's still classification errors, and they can mislead the user of the accounts. So, but as I say, I think it's something that the authority is going to tighten up on a little bit this year. Yeah,
if I just describe the situation in relation to 8, I suspect that's probably my fault. I mean, you can appreciate that when you're building something and you're building something new, the way that we account for that is very much an asset under construction, and the value of it reflects the amount in the capital programme. I took the decision at the time that when that asset was complete, that we would then look to actually revalue the existing asset that was in the books. Because in certain cases, particularly in relation to schools, what you have is that you may very well having a new asset under construction while still using the old asset. So actually doing that impairment risk too early, I think you may very well be either underestimating the value of the asset done, but having taken some advice on these particular examples, I mean, we're very happy to change our process to actually look at this annually as an impairment aspect rather than on the completion of the work. So there wasn't anything sinister in not doing it. In relation to the short term versus long term, actually in the accounts, they're on the same page, adjacent to each other in terms of lines, in terms of liabilities. So the overall liabilities isn't affected. I acknowledge the fact that actually a year and a day constitutes long term, and actually under a year equates to short term. And the unfortunate thing is that the way that the ledger is set up doesn't provide that automatic distinction. Someone has to go in and remember to check these things, and unfortunately it's simply a case that a human error has occurred.
So essentially, you've got a real school and a virtual school. It's running side by side.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Monmouthshire and Caldecott, I mean, we didn't flatten one school and have one asset. For a period of times, we had one asset under construction and one asset that we were still utilising. The failure, such as it is that we didn't undertake an impairment exercise on an annual basis while we were still using the original asset. So that from an auditor's point of view, they were looking at the asset in the accounts and saying, well, that's overstated because actually it's worth far less to you than that. That's one of the reasons why you're actually replacing it.
Yeah, okay.
Right, well, thank you for that. Well, noting that we do have agreed actions on all these items, and if there's no more further observations, I'd like to move on, please. But thank you, everyone. The next item on the agenda is the internal audit draft plan, which I think is going to be presented to us today by Mr. Walton.
Thank you, Chair. So this today before us is the first draft of our audit plan for consultation with the committee, and we're also issuing that for consultation with service departments currently. Our plan is primarily risk-based, focusing on areas which represent the greatest risks to the achievement of the authority's strategic objectives, the security of its assets, the prevention and detection of any fraud, corruption and bribery, and the achievement of value for money. Now, within that, there are some caveats. We need to be mindful of the results of our own previous audit work and the work of external audit and other assurance providers, and to include a proportion of lower risk audit areas each year to ensure that there's a good wide coverage across the whole authority. Otherwise, we'd effectively just be auditing the same narrow pool of services again and again year on year. We also need to be mindful of a number of pieces of work, primarily grant claim audits that are mandatory. In other words, the terms and conditions of those grants require that they have an internal audit certification, and obviously if we didn't do that, then we wouldn't get paid those grant monies. As usual, our plan includes an allocation of time for special investigations and unplanned work. This is used where new risks or concerns emerge during the year and are reported to us. As I said at the start, our plan is currently out for consultation. Andrew and I are going around the different directorate management teams at the moment. We've done 2 so far and have 2 more to go. We're also going to see the whole authority safeguarding group next week to talk about their needs for next year. Once that consultation period is over, and once the year-end position is known, so we know exactly where we are in respect of those jobs that are ongoing at year-end, we will then pull together a final plan and the aim is to bring that back to committee during Q1 for discussion and hopefully approval at that stage. That's all I wanted to say by introduction, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We'll just note that the recommendation is that the Audit Committee reviews, comments and shapes the early draft audit plan with a view to receiving a more detailed plan, as you've just told us. Do we have any questions or observations from the committee, please? Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. On page 20, you refer to two high risks of borough theatre and events. I won't mention the next one online, ADM, that's been dealt with. The Borough Theatre has recently come back into authority control. What comments can you make on that for the finalisation report? And where are you in the follow-up to events, which has been rolling for a little while?
Okay. In respect of the Borough Theatre, we were asked to do a consultancy piece of work around about this time last year when it was still outside of the authority. And that report found a number of issues which were highlighted, and that's kind of led to it being allocated as a high risk in this plan. We are currently undergoing a follow-up to that piece of work, which is in progress currently. Whilst that has not yet been finalised, I can provide some assurance that controls have improved significantly over the last 12 months. So we are anticipating a more favourable opinion when that report is concluded. In respect of events, I think the history of different audit reports is well known by members of this committee. We have done a sort of interim follow-up report, which primarily focused on some of the smaller events, including last November's firework display at Caldecott Castle. Again, I'm pleased to report that controls around that were improved, and there has been some progress. However, I'm mindful of the fact that we haven't had, if you like, a major scale event of the nature of some of the ones that we had previously. So until any further events of that magnitude are done and sort of signed off and reviewed by ourselves more favourably, it's still very much on our radar, and we're still in discussion with the events team over their programme of events for future, and we're still keeping it very much on our radar.
How do you monitor events within the environs of the Caldecott Castle, for example, which are run by other bodies in terms of monitoring the work they do on a particular day in terms of car parking and access like that, which has seemed to be a problem in the past where parking wasn't controlled properly, the cashing buckets and things like that. Do you monitor that as well, or do you leave that to the team in Caldecott Castle?
We have done, this year in fact, we've done an audit of the castle itself. So that looked at things like weddings that are staged at the castle and private bookings. So we have done some coverage there. Again, that report is, I think that one's currently being finalised at the moment. So in due course, probably our next progress report, you'll see details of the outcome of that audit opinion.
Thank you. Any other questions or observations, please? Councillor Smith.
A lot of reports, a lot of work goes into this document. Are all the reports easily accessible to members? Are we notified? Because they come obviously at stages throughout the year. I personally, as a member, trying to find my way, would appreciate being notified of a report being concluded and actually having the opportunity to look at it, not necessarily in the committee, just for my own personal understanding. I also found it interesting, the questions asked by Councillor Easton, the ongoing controls regarding events at Caldecott Castle, because I am not aware myself, I know I missed a meeting of an actual rounding up and conclusion of that report as to how things had actually worked out at the end, that one. And then you made reference as well to the theatre, a report ongoing. Was that report ongoing before it was determined that the theatre would be taken back and operated for a further 2 years by Monmouthshire?
Right, I'll see if I can try and remember those. In respect of the theatre, the original audit review was done whilst it was still outside the authority. We were invited in to carry out that piece of work. Whilst we did not make any recommendations ourselves as to the appropriateness or otherwise of it staying outside or coming back into the authority, our report was looking more at the sort of financial controls, purchasing, salaries, etc., grants and so on. Our report was the original report was quite a critical one, and a number of significant risks were found in that report. Subsequently, the council and the trustees took the decision to transfer the theatre back into the council's stewardship. Our follow-up review has been done after that transfer, so once it was brought back into the council, and it's that report which has found progress has been made and a number of those recommendations have been addressed, albeit that report has not yet been finalised. Again, once that report is finalised, it will be included within our usual quarterly progress reports. I think probably there'll be one at the next meeting. I need to check that. In respect of member access to reports, it's never really been our practice that members get full audit reports. There are obviously a lot of reports and they go into a lot of detail. As far as I'm aware, most audit committees, certainly of local authorities, do not receive full copies of full reports. Obviously, we provide in our quarterly progress report a list of all the opinions and all the audits that we've completed within that quarter. It would, I guess, be a policy decision. That change would be needed to that if that was needed, and that would be a matter for others to decide, really. I think there was
Can I just make an inquiry then? The way it works with the committee, I think, is you give us a list of your reports which are satisfactory and which are not satisfactory. We often go into the non-satisfactory ones in fair detail. But a report having been flagged up as being not particularly remarkable, would it be available to a councillor if they requested it?
Yeah, I think unless there was any matters, potential criminality or anything like that, in which case we could probably look to do some redacting and then issue a redacted version to members if required. But yeah, as you say, it's normally the limited assurance opinion ones that get most attention at this committee.
Does that help at all? Yes.
If I look back to the theatre, make reference to the theatre and the report that was made, in my mind is, how was the decision made? Perhaps I slept through a council meeting and it was determined, yes, we're bringing this back in-house, we're going to operate it. Or is this a cabinet decision and it was just done in that way? Things interest me every now and then, and it's interesting to follow them up, and sometimes it's a complete waste of time. Other times I think, that was worth the effort.
I think, and by all means colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was a case that the trustees themselves, when they were looking at the future financial projections of the theatre and the levels of support that were coming from both the Arts Council Wales and from this authority, had concerns about their own viability, financial viability, and so they agreed with the council that it would transfer back almost voluntarily.
Okay, is there any other questions or observations relative to this this report from internal audit? Yes, go ahead.
Chair, can I just want to come back just on the point that's been raised by Councillor Smith, in terms of into access to internal audit reports, and Dave has summarised in his response correctly to that. I think the only point I would make really is just striking appropriate balance, and it's not a case of trying to withhold information from Audit Committee or any member, in fact. They have right and access to that, as do members of the public, in fact. Again, with obviously sensitivities around matters that need to be redacted, etc. But the point I would make is, and what we look to do here and through Audit Committee, is to draw to member of the Audit Committee's attention those significant matters that need attention. Internal audit reports, by their very nature, can be quite lengthy documents. They can contain a lot of what I would probably describe as trivial matters that probably don't need to consume an awful lot of airtime within an Audit Committee. And therefore, the approach that certainly has been taken, and as Dave has touched on, it's brought to the committee's attention those significant matters and those significant risks. And that's generally the approach that's been taken. The only other point I want to make, really, it's a bit of a wrap-up comment, really. Dave, at the front end, explained the process with regards to what you're receiving here, which is an early draft of the internal audit plan. Dave has referred to the consultation that's taking place internally to make sure that we get feedback from various parts of the organisation. And bear in mind, an audit plan should be risk-based. That's what it should be. And it's very, very much the reason as to why we're talking to Audit Committee today, just to get their feedback and input in terms of the perceived risks from an Audit Committee perspective. There is just one other, I guess, stage in the cycle just to touch on. The leadership team, comprised of clearly the chief executive, chief officers, monitoring officer, etc. They will receive sight of a more developed draft, and they will be given an opportunity to provide comment into the plan. And again, from their perspectives and in terms of where they see there being a risk that needs to be featured as part of an internal audit plan. So I thought it would just be useful just to highlight that for members' attention.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Howcroft wants to make a comment.
Understanding your interest, Councillor, it was discussed by Cabinet on the 28th of February to consider accepting the surrender of their lease, and the lease was physically surrendered on the 9th of April.
Thanks for that. I'll move on then, if that's acceptable. So thank you very much for that, Mr. Walton. The next item on the agenda is update on anti-bribery compliance. We have a presentation from Chief Officer Resources. So I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I've just had to move a seat because the wire does not stretch that far. First off, can I just issue an apology? Very loud today, the mics, aren't they? Can I just issue an apology to Audit Committee just for the delay in this update presentation coming through. I was unable to attend the last meeting, unfortunately, due to the news of the passing of Joy Robson, Head of Finance. So I had to go and inform staff, unfortunately, in that afternoon. So just an apology and I'm sure you'll understand my reasons for not being able to attend. So the Audit Committee will be familiar with the fact that the anti-bribery compliance internal audit report has seen 2 limited updates, consecutive limited updates, and very much the reason as to why the Chair and the Audit Committee has requested the update. What I'm going to do today, is it on the screens, just to always... Okay, members, you've each got electronic copies of the presentations that have been circulated to you. Do you all have access to that? Well, we can thank Dave for his technical prowess. Well done, Dave. Okay, so I guess the objectives for me today really is, as sort of outlined there, to provide Audit Committee with an overview of the current policy, to provide just a brief overview and chronology of the events that relate to both the policy review and update, but also the situation with internal audit reviews and follow-ups being undertaken. But I guess the substance of this is concerns, I guess, the main issues that arose from the original audit review being undertaken, action that has been taken to address the recommendations at this juncture, and then providing reassurance of, I guess, what I'd probably refer to as work in progress, and where I'd expect the remaining and outstanding recommendations to be addressed and reasonably in quick time. And then finally, and I guess this can come as a result of some of the questions that I'm sure will come, I guess it's from my perspective offering maybe a suggested way forward in terms of proposed next steps. So in terms of the current policy, I think it's useful for members of the Audit Committee just to sort of get this update and refresh. I have, through the clerk to the committee, had hard copies of the actual full policy circulated to you. You've got that at your disposal, but I'm not going to go into that sort of depth, but just over a handful of slides just to sort of give you an overview, just to say that Cabinet approved an updated and revised policy statement in March 2017. And as it says there, the purpose of the policy is encouraging that culture in the organisation that certainly deters fraud, bribery and corruption, and equally provides that very strong and consistent message that any allegations will be dealt firmly and again in a consistent way. I think we all recognise the Council is one of the, if not the largest organisation in the county. Millions and millions of pounds of public money, and clearly we take very seriously public expectation and the scrutiny to which the affairs of the Council are subject to. And good corporate governance, as it touches on there, demonstrates that the authority really must be committed to dealing with fraud and corruption, and whether that is with perpetrators inside or in fact outside of the council. It's important to touch on there is no distinction. It's obviously a commonly misunderstood point. There is no distinction made when investigation is undertaken between cases that generate financial benefit and in fact those that do not. And the policy statement, as refers there, outlines those measures that are designed to frustrate any attempt, as well as the action that then occurs. I'm not going to spend time. You've got the policies at hand, and which refers to I guess the three key offences which sort of defines fraud, that definition that surrounds corruption, and equally the four key offences that associate themselves with the Bribery Act 2010. But suffice to say that the policy embodies those measures, and it's often, and again, a misunderstood point, the ramifications. Employees that are found guilty, that does carry a custodial sentence. There is a maximum sentence of 10 years imprisonment where guilt has been found, and that potential for an unlimited fine when there's guilt being found of bribery. The policy does outline those very specific responsibilities for officers and members, and defines how the council goes about deterring that. And importantly, and I guess it may come as a result of whether this discussion today or subsequently, what I'm suggesting is a further report pre-summer recess, but the policy is subject to continuous review. It is updated on a 3-year basis, and it was last, if you recollect, it was last approved in June of 2017. We will, within the throes of the next 12 months, need to be undertaking further review and bringing a revised policy through. So just in terms of that chronology, Audit Committee, just to, I'm sure some of you will remember this anyway, but back in March of 2017, Audit Committee received the draft revised and updated anti-fraud, bribery, corruption policy. So the Audit Committee endorsed that at that point. And I think if I jump to the third bullet, subsequently then Cabinet approved that in June of that year. But if I just go back a month into May, in the intervening months, Audit Committee actually received an update from Internal Audit, which confirmed that the audit report for compliance with the Bribery Act received its first limited audit opinion. As is standard, and I think members of the committee will be familiar with this, there was, as a result, a follow-up audit undertaken. That came back to Audit Committee, or Audit Committee was certainly notified of that at the committee meeting in May of 2018, and that a second consecutive limited assurance audit opinion had been given. So I think it's just important, just briefly, just to touch on what the scope of that audit review was. It's all outlined there, but I will touch on each point. First off, making sure that there is that ingrained anti-bribery culture, that zero tolerance stance. Secondly, that the policy, systems and working practices that are clearly designed to aid prevention and detection, and that there are appropriate review processes in place. Also, that there are mechanisms and policies in place for employees and, in fact, others to voice their concerns. And finally, that there are formal procedures followed to investigate any suspected fraud or bribery. So that is, in effect, what Dave, I guess, and his team did in terms of assessing the control environment that was in place. So in terms of the summary of the limited audit opinion and, in fact, the second one, in the original audit review, there were 16 significant and moderate recommendations brought forward. The follow-up review, and I guess I was disappointed to find that 3 had been fully implemented. Only 3 had been fully implemented. 11 had not been implemented at the time of that follow-up audit, and 2 were still in situ. And clearly, and for those reasons, given the significant number of recommendations that were still outstanding, Internal Audit, and rightly drew conclusion that it warranted a second limited opinion. The main issues that arose from, and I'm going to refer back to the original audit because that's what everything hangs off. First off, that new members of staff were not receiving corporate induction training, and despite, and there is a mandatory requirement, there is an expectation within this authority, and absolutely and rightly so, that any new starter is entitled to induction, and I think we should all expect and understand that. There wasn't at that time of the original report a designated officer with authority, with responsibility for compliance. The policy statement hadn't been reviewed and updated for Bribery Act 2010. Employees were not being made aware of, I guess, the severity of the ramifications and repercussions of non-compliance. Furthermore, the authority hadn't performed risk assessments around likelihood and impact. Limited information being in place for employees to guide them around, I guess, financial interest, conflict of interest, etc. And interestingly, when I was bringing this presentation together and actually going right back to the debate that ensued in May of 2017, when Audit Committee considered the first limited audit opinion, there was quite a lot of discussion around conflict of interest and, in fact, hospitality, and highlighted the point really. There was a lot of questions asking for clarification. And then finally, then, in terms of there not being an up-to-date authorised signatory list being maintained for procurement decisions. So that doesn't look like particularly good reading, as you can imagine, on first read. What I'm going to walk you through now is I'm going to, I guess, work you all back to a point of hopefully giving you a level of comfort and reassurance in terms of where we're now at. So, First of all, I, as Chief Officer for Resources, I'm now designated as having that overall responsibility for ensuring the effectiveness of the policy and obviously compliance with both the Fraud Act and the Bribery Act. We have, and as stated earlier, there was a revised and updated policy statement approved by Cabinet in June 2017. That has been made available to all staff. That is also available on the authority's intranet. The Code of Conduct has in fact been updated twice since issues have been raised, dealing with matters concerning conflict of interest, gifts and hospitality, and there are the sort of other more minor aspects that were raised as a result of the audit report that have also been addressed. And we have started now, and funnily enough, it'll be now in the next couple of weeks that our second annual reminders will be going out to staff with regards to declarations of interest needing to be made, and again, those needing to be in accordance with the updated Code of Conduct. We have also reviewed and updated the whistleblowing policy. That's available now on both the authority's intranet and the public-facing website, because you'll be clearly aware that with the whistleblowing policy, those whistleblowing allegations can come from outside and not just from within. And I think it's probably just worthy of note just on whistleblowing. I think in Wales Audit Office's work programme over the next 12 months, there is a follow-up, or in whichever way it's described, there is a review of whistleblowing that is going to be undertaken. So I know that members of the improvement team and relevant officers are working with WAO colleagues at the moment, just in terms of putting some of the preparations in place for that. Furthermore, the exemption from contract procedure rules, the forms and the guidance have been updated. I know that Dave and equally Andrew have done work in refreshing and updating that. We have brought that through and had that approved through senior leadership team, and to make sure that chief officers, senior officers were aware. And the updates, there have been numerous updates, but probably the ones to draw out in the context of fraud, corruption, etc., is again making sure that there is confirmation when those exemptions are being signed. There is confirmation that there are no conflicts of interest present, that there is necessary eligibility for approval, and by that I mean if an exemption is being requested, it is on good grounds. And then finally, that decisions, and I think Internal Audit have identified and had issues with this previously, where exemption forms are being signed by inappropriate officers. So all of those things have been satisfactorily addressed now within the guidance, the forms, and some of the process that wraps around that. And then finally, in terms of induction, we have induction checklists that are now in place for managers to complete. So when a new starter joins with the authority, there is a requirement on the starter form that prompts them to complete the induction checklist. That induction checklist, and I use the word should, and I will come back to it in a minute, should prompt the manager to ensure that that new starter makes their way onto induction training. Is not often and always the case. I will come back to it. But furthermore, that they are provided with any necessary training and referred to the information that they need to see sight of in their role. So that's what's been done. That is all completed action. That's all stuff that's in place and in train. So that's sort of step one in terms of looking to provide you all with some reassurance and comfort. And then in terms of ongoing progress, things that are in train at the moment, and I'll start with the one that's probably the most frustrating one for me, I have to admit, which is to do with the new starters receiving induction training. So on the positive, Internal Audit now attend induction training. They have been now for a few quarters, and there are modules around financial management, and I know Internal Audit colleagues are present to provide advice and guidance on matters that includes anti-bribery, fraud and corruption. So that bit is dealt with. The issue and the frustration really is that our system at the moment is reliant on managers to ensure that new starters actually make their way onto induction training. We don't have a sufficiently robust and probably automated system to prompt that and to ensure that every every new starter gets what should be expected of them. We are, whilst we are pushing that message and hard through chains of senior management, we are separately developing a system-driven solution. So where I refer there to onboarding. Onboarding is a technical sort of HR term, which is essentially when somebody comes and it's the very start of somebody having an interest in joining the authority. So the onboarding process is from that very, very early point all the way through recruitment, selection, appointment, coming into the authority, being provided with all the necessary induction and training, etc., necessary to allow them to do their job properly. Okay, and that whole onboarding process is something that we are redesigning at the moment so that it is much more system orientated. It's a very fragmented process at the moment, and if you put yourself in the shoes of a new starter, it's quite a protracted process. And we often get feedback from new starters to say, to sort of say, and I'll be quite frank and honest, to say that the experience sometimes hasn't been great as it should be. So, we are working at that, and with systems in place at the moment and what we can look to do, we can make that whole experience an awful lot better. But the experience is good, and that's one thing, but the other important aspect is making sure that those new starters clearly understand some of the very key rules and regulations that they're responsible for. The next point then is to do with periodic risk assessments. It was highlighted in the original report. What I am proposing to do, because there was some debate around this with internal audit colleagues and with colleagues from the performance team, what I'm proposing to do, because there was a suggestion as to whether this needed to come either up into Cabinet or to Audit Committee, from my perspective, it is Audit Committee's sort of role and remit to receive that sort of ongoing annual risk assessment around bribery, fraud and corruption. So I am looking to complete that first annual risk assessment and actually bring that into Audit Committee prior to the summer recess. But if, again, just sort of providing some comfort into you all and liaising with Dave and the internal audit team just to sort of understand in my role on an ongoing basis the sort of levels of any level of particular level of fraud or bribery, corruption, etc., that may be being dealt with by internal audit colleagues or other senior officers. As it says there, we've seen very low levels of benefit fraud. I don't think that will be a surprise to you, but we have processes, robust processes in place around that through the shared benefit service and also through the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP. I've liaised with Dave in bringing the presentation together today just to make sure on a timely basis, and I don't think, Dave, we're aware of any sort of definitive cases having been confirmed in this year of account. Clearly there is risk that's always present around the areas that are listed there: capital, contracts, contracting matters and social care, PTU, transport, etc. Clearly, I'll be looking to draw reference to those areas and providing, again, some comfort and reassurance when I come back to Audit Committee in due course. In terms of training for staff, Andrew, again, is probably a little bit frustrated because he has, in my mind, made best endeavours to try and get the training in place. The external provider that we have lined up and have had confirmed to run that training, we've had a few issues in actually being able to get that arranged. I would anticipate, and certainly by the time that I come back into Audit Committee, that we will have that in train. And a bite-sized video is being developed alongside other information such as the policy, etc., and to be made available to staff. The final bit then of the jigsaw is with regards to our contract procedure rules. There were a few recommendations, a small number of recommendations, separate recommendations that were raised by internal audit that related to matters of procurement and compliance with contract procedure rules, or in fact things that maybe weren't sufficiently explicit within our existing contract procedure rules. The first of that is with regards to, as I referred to earlier, an authorised signatory list. and making sure that any approval of purchases or awarding of contracts was in line with that up-to-date list. The second matter was with regards to suppliers and that they are assessed for any history of bribery. And the third and fourth matters were with regards to declarations of non-interest, and in fact where there is interest, where we're talking about going through a procurement, that there are appropriate and revised arrangements being put in place. And the final piece really is just a strengthening, I think, Dave, isn't it? I think it's a strengthening around the need for appropriate segregation of duties, and again, to just make that more explicit within our contract procedure rules, so staff clearly understand. And it is a difficulty that we have in this authority because we are small. We have some teams that are very small, and particularly when you're looking at chain of command. In order to actually get adequate segregation of duties, it does become quite difficult at times. But that doesn't mean that you don't do it. So I think it's a case of both through the contract procedure rules and in fact the buyer's guide, which is, I guess, the handbook that sits behind it. We need to be providing better advice to staff around that. In terms of next steps, clearly, and in my role, I need to ensure progress is being made, and again, to satisfy internal audit colleagues as well as audit committee that there is that suitably robust control environment in place. And as I've touched on a couple of times, I guess my proposal is either immediately prior or subsequent to the summer recess. I'll be driven really by audit committee and the chair. To confirm progress made where we have those items that are still in work in progress. To confirm progress made in implementing outstanding recommendations in full, and by that I mean that all recommendations that have been raised by internal audit have actually been acted upon. And then secondly, as I touched on, to bring that annual assessment of risk back into audit committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'll pass it over to the committee then. Councillor Eason, please.
Yeah, thank you once again, Chair. I'll take you to not bullet point, or page 14, or which one? Yes, it's 14. You refer in there to risk is always present across a range of areas. Well, I know we've got 4,000 employees, and the majority of those would be less of a risk than those who would be more directly involved with outside contractors. What processes do we have in place to ensure that that individuals don't put themselves at risk by entering into contracts at a stage which might put them in a risk situation where they could be bribed, for example? Do we have processes in place for that?
Thank you, Councillor Eason. I mean, effectively, the contract procedure rules governs that whole environment, and comes back to the point around the authorised signatory list in some respects. It doesn't entirely hang off that, but officers of sufficient seniority are clearly dependent on the size and scale of any procurement. It is commensurate with the level of seniority that needs to authorise and sign that off. But obviously beyond that, there is and has been separate training and awareness sessions run around contract procedure rules, and procuring and contracting managers are cited on the steps that they need to be taking, and where there are not just procurement risks, but in the throes of what we're discussing today, that there is an awareness around that. So I'm satisfied that through the broadly in the arrangements that we've got in place, and I've got to be careful in terms of not committing too far on that one, but I'm comfortable in my role in terms of bribery, anti-bribery, corruption, etc. I'm satisfied that there is a sufficiently robust control environment in place, and as the contract procedure rules allow. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or observations, please? Councillor Murphy.
Only just an observation, Chair. I think Peter's put an awful lot of procedures in place here. It'll be interesting to see the the feedback now, and perhaps in the summer we'll be able to monitor the progress. But I think there's so much been introduced here now that the time has come to let them progress with it, and we'll see what happens later on.
Thank you. And if there are no other questions or observations, I'd just like to thank Mr. Davis very much for the very detailed presentation. And you'll no doubt, well, you've already outlined ways in which the Audit Committee will be kept on board in future. So good, thank you very much for that.
Chair, can I just ask, just for points of clarification and obviously tasking staff, just in terms of coming back into the Audit Committee, is the preference for me to bring both the annual risk assessment and at closing the loop, I guess, on and providing that absolute reassurance that all recommendations have been acted upon? Is that something that you as Chair and the Audit Committee wish to have either pre or post summer recess, given, I guess, the forward work programme?
I think it's always more timely than less timely is always better, but it's just a general procedure. But of course, the agendas can get full, but I don't see any. There's no reason from our point of view to delay. I don't think.
Okay.
Unless anyone thinks differently. Well, thank you. The next item on the agenda is the Wales Office Audit Plan 2019-2020. So I'll invite the Welsh Audit Office to present this paper, please.
Thank you very much. So this is our audit plan for 2019. It sets out the work that we are planning to undertake this year, when we're going to do that work, how much it's going to cost, and who will undertake the work. As you'll see, it's a plan in two halves, really. The first half sets out the financial audit work that we are going to do, and that's led by Terry, that many of you will know, and by Rodri here on my right. It's also then the second half sets out the performance audit work, which is led by Non Jenkins and Dave Wilson. So starting then with the financial audit work, as you know, we undertake a risk-based approach. And the risks that we've considered in determining our audit approach for this year are set out there in Exhibit 2. I wasn't proposing to talk you through those individually. There is nothing particularly unique there. So many of those risks would be common across our audit portfolio. As you know, we operate to the concept of materiality. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about fees, but I did specifically want to draw your attention to paragraph 12 there, which sets out really the assumptions we make, I suppose, in determining the audit fee. So as you'll see, we do assume that the financial statements are provided in accordance with the agreed timescales and to the quality expected, etc. In addition, really, then, it's probably worth noting paragraph 13, where we set out the sort of wider responsibilities that we have with regard to answering questions and objections to the accounts that are raised by electors, local electors. Setting out then more the performance audit work, Exhibit 3 really sets out the specific work that we are planning to undertake this year. Paragraph 19 onwards sets out then the grants work that we're going to undertake. We anticipate the level of work being similar to last year's, so we anticipate that we'll be doing work around non-domestic rates, HB subsidy, etc. You'll note there that of the 12 claims that we certified last year, 4 of them were qualified. So we'll be undertaking similar work again this year. The audit fee then, I suppose the important stuff, you'll notice a slight reduction, and that's mainly really around the anticipated, I think, reduction probably in the fee for grant certification work. We've absorbed very small increases in our fee rates this year, which you'll be pleased to know, I'm sure. The audit team is remaining the same as in previous years, so there will be good continuity there, hopefully, from your perspective. And the timetable is not dissimilar. It is probably worth pointing out once again, and I know we've discussed this previously, the fact that we are now going to be operating to a slightly earlier timetable going forward, and Monmouthshire will be operating to that earlier timescale this year. We're anticipating that we'll have a set of accounts with us by the end of May, which was absolutely excellent, actually. Probably not much point in talking through the appendices, but very, very happy to take any questions, obviously, if you have any.
Thanks for that. Just before we come on to points of questioning, Councillor, just to note that, again, we're here to note, discuss and comment on the plan if necessary. But I just wanted to give an opportunity to MCC officers to make any contribution they wish to in response to the WAO paper. I don't know who would be appropriate, but Mark, do you have anything?
Not particularly, Chair. I mean, I'm fairly familiar with the financial audit side of it, which is largely going to be on a recurring basis as it has been. Perhaps most of the changes are around the emphasis of performance audit, the looking at a resilience examination of local councils as part of its performance activities rather than necessarily its financial activities, and the focus more so on looking at assessing the value for money aspects of local authority considerations, perhaps placing more emphasis on that than necessarily the continuous improvement agenda in the past there. But I'm probably putting words in my audit colleague's mouth there. So
No, that's absolutely right. We've always had a requirement, as you'll be aware, under the Public Audit Wales Act to satisfy, or the Auditor General has to satisfy himself regarding the arrangements in place to secure economy, efficiency and effectiveness and the use of resources. We've previously really relied on our work under the local government measure, but there is a possibility that the local government measure will no longer apply to councils, which means that we are undertaking work really more on a sort of a risk-based approach to satisfy ourselves with regard to those requirements under the Public Audit Wales Act. So slightly different methodology this year. You'll see there the areas that we have decided to look at with regard to Monmouthshire specifically. Some of that work has actually been undertaken at other councils as well. So the financial sustainability work is something that we are undertaking at other councils as well.
Thank you. Do we have a contribution from either resources or internal audit?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to say that the leadership team, senior leadership team, have met with colleagues from Wales Audit Office. Very much welcomed that opportunity, and we had a very good, very open and constructive discussion, which in effect was assisting Wales Audit Office in focusing on those reviews that they felt were necessary based on assessments of risk, etc. So the three key ones that you'll see in the audit plan around both the shared resource service, the SRS, procurement, and financial things, resilience or sustainability. Certainly they are very high on our radar as well in the strategic risk assessment, and I also welcome Wales Audit Office approach really to engage early on that discussion, and also for us to feed back and into the scope of that work, so that it not only benefits Wales Audit Office in terms of taking forward its future work programmes, it also benefits the authority as well in its endeavours to address those issues.
Thank you. Yes.
Chair, just to add that from an internal audit point of view, we do give consideration to our WAO colleagues' planning in developing our own plan. I have spotted one subject area that's common to both plans before the committee today. So as part of the finalisation of our plan, we'll have discussions with WA colleagues and resolve that. So there's no duplication.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Higginson.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. I would elements that satisfy my curiosity. Thank you.
Councillor Eason.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed the report. Mom Farm Trust is mentioned. I'm a trustee of the Mom Farm Trust. I declare an interest, non-prejudicial.
Yes, I wondered what happened to declarations of interest on the agenda, but I'm glad to receive them as we go along. Councillor Murphy.
I should probably do that as well, Chair, but as we're not actually discussing it, I don't think it really counts this time.
My apologies, because I think I neglected to mention declarations of interest at the start. It is there as number 2 on the agenda, so it's my fault. No, it was. It was on there, so I should have covered it. Do we have any other questions or observations on the Wales Audit Office plan for the forthcoming year? There was just one thing that intrigued me that I thought that might be of interest to members. It's on page 9 or 35, depending on how you count it. Paragraph 3, a reference to the external auditor not being able to place reliance on work done under the measure in future. I just wonder whether someone could explain what was happening here.
It's my understanding that the anticipated Local Government Wales Bill will propose that the measure is no longer applicable to councils. So I wouldn't know any more than that particularly. I just know that we've determined as a result of that, to change a little bit the way in which we work. My performance audit colleagues would be able to provide you with more information if that would be helpful.
Mr. Howcroft.
But in essence, what we're looking at here is the auditors requiring to satisfy themselves first-hand rather than relying more so as they have done in the past on the control measures and the governance arrangements as told to by the council.
Okay. I don't know whether that actually addresses the issue, but I mean the measure has been repealed, or has there been subsequent legislation? It was repealed. Or will be repealed. Okay. So it's really saying that the legal framework is going to change.
I think it's a case of watch this space, Chair.
Thank you. I felt it was stated in vague terms, so that's probably the reason why. Okay, well, if there isn't anything else there then, I'd like to thank the presenters from the Wales Audit Office, Anne-Marie Harkin and Rodri Davies. We'll move on then to the next agenda item, which is about the certification of grants and returns. Now this is again, I think, a Wales Audit Office paper. So yes, it's for Rodri to introduce, please.
Yes, on a positive note, everyone hear me? We've now completed our 17-18 grants programme. We've certified 12 grant claims. That was the same as for 2016-17 for a cost of £68,000. This is slightly up on last year. I think it was 65,000 last year. If you want a full breakdown of that, it's on page 12. Fees per grant. Following the audits, it resulted in only £4,000 less being claimed by the council in respect to the 17-18 audits, but of the 12 grants audited, it did result in 4 being qualified. So if you turn to page 6, you can see a summary of the qualification issues. Two grants were qualified based on the council not following their contract procedure rules. One partnership agreement, sort of pooled budget arrangement, was qualified on the basis that the agreement wasn't in place and signed before the year commenced. And then the other two, local transport and bus services support grant, were mainly qualified on expenditure being outside of the 17-18 financial year, either before in the 16-17 or 18-19, or not having or being able to provide sufficient support and evidence for this. Happy to take any questions on this if you want any further explanation.
Right, well, as usual, I'm going to ask MCC officers if they've got a contribution to make at this stage. Would that be for you, Mr. Howcroft?
I guess so, Chair. Thanks. Reading this pretty much at the same time as you had it, councillors, it didn't really fill me with that particularly warm, fuzzy feeling that I hoped it would. But then I acknowledge that I set particularly high standards for myself and the team, and I knew that actually the way it's worded, it could be quite concerning. I've been thinking long and hard about the best way to respond, appreciating that ultimately I want to give members a confidence that the opportunities for further deficiency is mitigated. But I hope you'll bear with me that I might be a bit circumspect about the detail of some of that advice that I provided to senior management, because they're still considering their response to that at the moment. And I think if I volunteered it to members at this stage, I could be looked at as skewing the deck in my favour from an argument's point of view. So I hope you'd understand that professionally I wouldn't want to use members in that fashion. I think part of the weaknesses with this grant report is due to the fact that I sent a couple of grants back because I wasn't happy with them. The arrangement around the pooled budget arrangement, that was provided for me and I was asked to sign that, and it was only through my questioning that I understood that that agreement wasn't in place. So I appreciate that from my perspective, there was really nothing to sign until that agreement had been put in place, and as a result of which, rightly, we've been criticised for being late with the submission, but there was no way that I could have pushed that forward without an agreement being in place. I think the other sizable area is around bus services support grant that gets raised annually. Whilst I'm not a particular fanboy of passenger transport's financial administration in this regard, I do have some sympathy in their management of this budget. It is a very volatile budget to administer from a terms and conditions point of view. The amounts change through the year. The Welsh Government agree with the Regional Transport Authority that oversee and provide the awards for that, and they're based up in Rhondda and Taff. And the council ends up bearing the financial risk in being the banker to the arrangement, which wouldn't strike me as a very satisfactory arrangement. So there are certain proposals in place to change that going forward. But I think putting the paper in some context, I mean, generally the auditors report that they're happy that the arrangements are sound in place, and that's despite reducing accountancy capacity and an increasing split-sightedness amongst the staffs involved. There were 12 grants and returns looked at, and just to put that in context, that involves £79 million worth of expenditure and only £4,000 worth of adjustments, despite that accountancy capacity and the split-sightedness. I think I'd like to accept all the weaknesses as described by the WAO rather than put any mitigation in place to the committee at this stage. But actually, I'd just highlight a commonality and weakness around procurement compliance. Peter spoke about it earlier in terms of putting some changes in place around that and separation of duties and ensuring that. And I know that this committee in the past has had regard for that when it's had the auditors, the internal audit's response to contract exemptions or non-compliance with contracts. I think that's something that I will pick up again in due course in my own mind, because at the moment that level of accountability and the consequences of not following that aren't clearly understood in my mind as to how we might communicate that better to staff. But the one mitigation I put in place for them is that we increasingly rely on less settlement a year. Settlement funding allows us to plan for things appropriately and in advance of need. As a result of that, there are less staff involved, and actually what we're finding is that Welsh Government are passing out extraordinary grants within year to administer, with the additional gun to the head about they have to be fully incurred by the end of the financial year. So from a service manager's perspective, their ability to get that expenditure out the door to utilise that resource is quite constrained. But there must be a better way of doing it, whether it be by call-off contracts, whether it be by revising the buyer's guidance that allows them to do that within the same safe procurement framework of the council.
Thank you, Mr. Howcroft. Do you have a contribution you want to make at this point, Mr. Davies, or you'd rather listen to points raised? Yeah, okay, fine. Councillor Higginson.
Thank you, Chairman. The one I got is on the bus services support grant, and there's it's only a short item. It's only a couple of lines anyway, but it's about the expenditure where authority could not provide supporting invoices. I mean, I think that's a matter of concern, and I just wonder if any of the officers would have something to say about that.
Yeah, the detail of that involves things like audio-visual equipment that was installed upon buses. Where that's actually being installed as a retrograde equipment, obviously there's clearly an invoice for that work and the equipment involved. However, some of the buses were actually received new, and this is from other counterparties using these buses, with that equipment already installed. We didn't necessarily have the breakdown of the cost of the equipment versus the bus. It was just in the overall bus invoices. So those are the sorts of deficiencies that involved in being able to justify those costs particularly.
All right. So what you're saying in effect is that the vehicles, or however many of them, were bought with this equipment in situ. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, yes, Rodri.
Yeah, I think that in relation to the sort of the 225,000 there, the split between what wasn't supported by invoices and what Mark's explained was already fitted was around about 26,000. The 170 was in relation to expenditure that incurred before the financial year. So what happened was that the authority got monies off Welsh Government very late in the day for various things that they could spend the money on, one being audiovisual equipment, and then they used that money to allocate it to things that already happened retrospectively in 2015 in bus operators. Our interpretation of it is that money should be spent on the 17-18 financial year and the 18-19 financial year. Potentially there was a 6-month window after year end which they could have spent the money, but instead they used that funding for stuff that had already happened in previous financial years.
It's one of my descriptions about BSG being one of the more volatile grants to administer. The arrangements and rules of the game change. We will have instructions from Welsh Government that they are happy with the situation, but when they agree the auditing requirements, they will suggest something different to the auditors. This grant is unusual in that it has a rolling balance. So it is more normal with a grant that where it hasn't utilised the full extent of the grant, that goes back to the grant authority. This one, it stays within the grant and is rolled forward, so there is a multi-year aspect to this grant that is a bit unusual.
I'll go on to Councillor Murphy then.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think this comes back to the old chestnut about when is an exemption from contract procedure rules applicable and when isn't it? And in situations where there's a panic to get rid of a grant, I think sometimes we could still go for a proper exemption trail, even though we're up against it. As I say, the criticism often seems to be that the correct procedures aren't complied with, even though the reason for doing it is perfectly above board. So I think it's an interpretation of the rules quite often.
One of my things that occurred to me on reading this report was, why didn't we know about these contract procedure rules not being followed? And I realise now, sometimes internal audit will pick something up where an exemption has been applied for and not being properly carried through. But this seems to be something that was basically turned up by the grants report by the Wales Audit Office, which is why we've not seen it before. What my basic concern was that if this committee exists for a purpose, it's to make sure that senior officers and the cabinet and the council and so on are aware of these issues as they arise. As I understand it, these are now being considered by the senior leadership team. Is that right, Mr. Davis? Which I would find reassuring.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think specifically in terms of the non-compliance with contract procedure rules, I think as Mark alluded to earlier, and members of the committee should be familiar with this as well, we brought a revised procurement strategy through Cabinet last summer, and one core aspect of that is around strengthening some of our practice. I think there's probably two key areas within the throes of compliance where I've got not necessarily concern. I guess, as you've alluded to, Chair, unless it gets drawn through an internal or an external audit and gets brought in front of us, I've putting things in context. I've got 2 full-time officers overseeing strategic procurement for the entire organisation. So, their time needs to be allocated very carefully. However, that said, as we trip into next year and we start to muscle up, I guess, around some of the efforts that need to be made around not, ultimately from direction of travel set by the procurement strategy, but just in terms of some of the foundational stuff around strengthening our contract procedure rules, not just the procedure rules themselves, but actually the practice within the organisation. Some of that is around training. Some of that is around some decisions to be made as to how devolved our procurement expertise is. So as I described, we have 2 core corporate resources and full-time equivalents at the moment, and the rest is distributed and dispersed across the many services that we deliver as an organisation. And there's no right and wrong answer there. A centralised or a decentralised model can work well. However, I'm not at that point of having sufficient comfort around that yet. Another deficiency is in and around our procurement system. And when I say system, I mean IT system. We are very much reliant at the moment on our financial system, our accounts payable module, which allows us to obviously make payments to suppliers. And a lot of our procurement data is underpinned by what goes out through the door. We need to, and we will be looking to draw up a specification for what we see as a procurement system fit for now and for the future. And that needs to have both a backward-looking and a forward-looking aspect. We need to have a much more solid grip on our contract register and an understanding of procurements that are due to work their way through, so that we can be more preemptive around some of the pre-procurement work that needs to be done, but also, and this is the important point, when we are cited on procurements, and particularly notable procurements working their way through, we can actually lean resource appropriately into that to make sure that not just that contract procedure rules are followed, the compliance bit is important, but actually that we get best value out of what we do. So there's a multi-pronged sort of approach there. What I would sort of wrap up with before I come to the specific points in the grant audit report, sort of Dave alluded to it earlier, just in terms of internal, external audit resource and not duplicating matters. So if everybody's been paying attention today, we can test this one. The audit plan that WAO presented earlier, that refers to a specific piece of work around procurement. internal audit in their internal audit plan, whilst it's not specifically itemised as a piece of work around procurement, Dave, you'll correct me if there is, but in a lot of the internal audit reviews that are undertaken, there are aspects of that work that actually touch on procurement. So the conversation I've been having with Dave and Andrew is to make sure that the audit scope is, and it only needs a few tweaks, but just to make sure that I am getting comfort from a procurement perspective in my role as Chief Officer. I am getting the necessary comfort and feedback back in from the internal audit work to understand where there are deficiencies. I need to just make sure that, I guess, the work that's programmed in with Wales Audit Office, that possibly looks at things from maybe a different perspective. And furthermore, I am looking to commission some further resource to work with our strategic procurement department over the next 3 to 4 months to go through what I describe as the first phase of work in moving our procurement strategy forward. There's no point in all of that resource in being deployed and it all duplicating each other. I've got to make sure, given the array of sort of weaknesses that we've talked about, I need to make sure that that resource is properly deployed such that we get good recommendations coming out of the back of it and that we can suitably act upon that. And clearly, I've got an intent here with the revised procurement strategy to make, to really take steps forward in strengthening our practice and our compliance. In terms of the grant report itself, there are 2 specific grants, I think, where there has been, I guess, departure from contract procedure rules. One is the land drainage grant, one is the local transport fund. I've been in discussion with the head of operations, Roger Hoggins, just to seek my own reassurances and beyond what Rodri has helpfully circulated onto me in terms of the background support in detail. So with the land drainage grant, I think WAO stated, although CPRs were not followed in the awarding of the works, MCC procurement process was. Now, whilst appreciating CPRs weren't followed, I am, I guess, at least comforted that MWA, which was the company that was appointed, that they did have the relevant knowledge and expertise to deliver the scheme and as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. And furthermore, on this one, because I'm not going to bore you with all the history on this one, but there was urgency for the scheme to be delivered as quickly as possible. There was urgency. Now, arguably, and it is the case, and I've discussed this with the head of operations, there would have been sufficient grounds, I feel, for an exemption in terms of emergency. Okay, hindsight is a wonderful thing. That didn't happen, and the company was appointed. So I'm not disputing the point that was made by WAO, but there was a procurement process in terms of orders being appropriately raised, etc., for the works. On the local transport fund, there are I think 2 or 3 schemes that feature within this. The most significant of those relates to Land Foist Active Travel Bridge, which some of you may be familiar with. There's and for that one in particular, and Rodri, I don't think you had this information provided to you in the in drawing conclusion on the audit, but I have seen sight of an exemption from CPRs for one of the contracts. What I think has happened is it hasn't actually made its way back into internal audit, which is where I think the deficiency has occurred. So I have seen a signed exemption, but it hasn't made its way. And I've looked at the grounds given for the exemption, and I feel them to be reasonable. But that aside, that information was not made available, and I think you cited that in your documentation. I think with the 2 remaining contracts, they were continuation of projects for previous years, and certainly based on the explanations I've had, continuity was key, and often is the case for transport schemes which actually develop stage by stage. They go through various stages of development, feasibility all the way up and through, and that continuity from an operational perspective is important. I'm not disputing the fact that our contract procedure rules should have required that to actually at least have gone out to the market. But I have spoken with Roger, but I will also be speaking to the Chief Officer for Enterprise, Francis Williams, just to make sure that efforts are taken to strengthen the process going forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. Are there any more questions from the committee or observations? Councillor Smith.
One that intrigued me was the pooling set up with an Iron Bevan Health Trust as to whether they actually did pay into the fund eventually. I'm on a learning curve, as I told you, Chairman. I'm trying to understand. I find it amazing as well to hear just now Mr Davis's narration, because to me it would seem simple process should be there, and people who are in post for a long time should surely know how the system should work and comply. But the Iron Bevan one really intrigued me.
Do we have anything on that?
Yeah, the Section 33 is a legal-based opportunity to share costs between a local authority and a health board. Okay, so without that being in place, there is really no opportunity to share costs from a shared service point of view. And we have a couple of agreements in relation to Section 33, Mardy Park and Monnow Vale being the two most notable ones. Okay, so without a Section 33, any conversations that Council and Health Board had in terms of actually affording those shared services were really rather redundant, because they didn't have a mechanism to passport those costs across. So that introduced the risks in relation to last year's accounts that actually net, because in one of the schemes that we manage and one of the schemes that the Health Board manage, that neither party would be able to actually share the costs that it had presumed to in its budgeting and monitoring through the year. So it was important to me to actually get that agreement signed retrospectively. And actually, I was probably a bit cute in involving WA colleagues who thankfully also do the Iron Bevan audit, because they were in doing the audit of an Iron Bevan at the time. And I was saying, well, you know, we really need this to be resolved. So going back to your original question, there was a process to be followed. I couldn't actually physically do the work to actually approve the expenditure, even though it was on the ledger, because the issue was one of principle in terms of being able to share those costs. And actually there was no value in signing a Section 33 certificate if a Section 33 agreement hadn't been agreed between the two parties.
Did this have any impact on the service that we were trying to provide as a council with an Iron Bevan?
Not in reality, and subsequent to the end of the financial year, you asked whether they've paid now. The matter was accrued at the end of last year in relation to those items, and subsequently the cash flow items have been resolved in this financial year, which isn't unusual.
I find it amazing, Chairman, it's such a high-profile issue, I would think, this combined service, and that it could be fluffed along in this way is interesting.
Thank you very much for that question and for the clarification. Well, if there are no further observations or questions about this, I would again thank the Wales Audit Office for the report and the officers for their responses and for the discussion. The next item on the agenda is the forward work plan. Officers will know I value having the forward work plan as fully filled out as possible. I know we're coming to the end of the annual cycle now, so it's sometimes a bit more difficult to do, but I will continue to press for as much information to be provided as to what's going to be coming up. I think it just help us to plan our work, and it is also some evidence for what the committee actually is doing. So if we don't have any, do we have any further questions or observations on the forward work plan? Yes, Councillor Murphy.
Just to note, Chair, that in view of the conversation that we've just concluded, CPR exemptions are on there, so perhaps will give us a further opportunity of examining that.
Yes, I'd hope so. I'm sure there's a number of other things we can add to the forward plan, and that we could also look further ahead. Okay, I'll move on then. We now have the minutes of the previous meeting coming at the end of the agenda. Are there any points anyone wishes to make or queries about those minutes?
I prepare to move we accept them, Chairman.
Do you highlighted at one point, Chairman, that you covered up? Clarification.
Okay, do I need a second? Yes, Councillor Murphy seconded. So we'll accept the minutes of the previous meeting, and we'll note the date of the next meeting will be the 2nd of May. So thank you very much, everybody.